Hello and welcome to the business interview on France24. France's trade balance deficit has hit a record level of 39 billion and 171 million euros in 2007 because of the rise in oil prices, the appreciation of the euro, but also because of the decline in France's economic competitiveness. To discuss this matter, I'm happy to introduce Hervé Novelli, French Secretary of State for Business and Foreign Trade. Thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure.
Great pleasure for us. You also were the UMP deputy for the 4th constituency of Indre-et-Loire. You were the private secretary to Alain Madelin when he was Minister of the Industry, so we could say you are a free market proponent. The 39 billion and 171 million euro of trade deficit in France is unprecedented and has gotten worse in 2004.
This is unprecedented. That's historical deficit that we inherited from 2006 and again from 2005.
It's gotten worse, though.
Yes, it's widening. And that is the issue. As you said, we have energy prices here and the value of euro, which is hampering our exports. Let's not here call, this is not all doom and gloom. We are the 5th largest exporter in Europe. When we look at that deficit, in addition, that needs to be weighed up against the historical level of our exports. We have never exported sold as much, but not enough to cover then the oil costs. That's the fact. And there are structural causes here that we need to then address, and the government is doing that right now.
Just to compare France's situation with Germany's, Germany faces the same constraints as France, a strong currency and high oil prices. Well, Germany's trade balance has a very high surplus, at least it had in November, so it's not a matter of economic context.
Right. That is about structural weaknesses, shortcomings that we now need to overcome.
What can
Look
we
at
do
Germany.
then?
The German model works, and there are reasons for that. That model in Germany is something we should look at in terms of we need more SMEs. We have very small companies and very large companies, but we need more medium-sized companies and larger companies. It's a longer-term policy strategy. We need to make sure that our companies have their own equity capital to finance and fund their exports. Their tax burden needs to be eased. We need to make sure that we innovate. Those companies need to innovate more. That requires a structural policy that has now been introduced by our government, then to promote innovation.
Quite so, innovation. Well, is there a lack of R&D in France within SMEs, and what do you think about this law on tax credit for investment in R&D?
I think it's fine. I actually called for it for years. I have supported a tax credit mechanism. If you spend 100 euros on R&D, the idea is to receive a tax credit back of 50 euros that you will invest in companies then that enter that mechanism the first time, and 30 euros if they're entering that mechanism for a second time. In other words, it will cost half less. So with that credit and with the research agency, funding agencies and the investors and their independence together, France will become a country that will promote and foster innovation more ambitiously than any other easy country.
The tax credit on R&D, will that be sufficient to make France more competitive?
That is not enough, of course. We need a policy on patents. We don't register enough patents. We need to do more. We need to reduce patent license fees. We need a policy so that each company and company leader needs to then look at intellectual property issues. We need to then look at and stamp out counterfeiting. This is a structural policy that we are now beginning to set up at the same time. This is a mid-term policy. Against that, I'm going to set up what I call the 10 then export boosting measures that are specific, that will balance then the structural measures that are key and crucial that I mentioned earlier to restore our companies' competitiveness.
We'll come back to this later, but there seems to be, according to experts, a problem with the funding of SMEs in France. There's more and more public funds allocated to it, but we still lack business angels in France. What can we do about it?
You're quite right. What is a business angel? It's an investor, you or myself. We will invest in the share capital of a small or medium-sized company. To do that, to today, we've now set up a mechanism whereby if you are paying wealth tax in France, then that tax, rather than give it to the taxman, you're going to invest it in a small and medium-sized company, which is far better, is it not? To know that your money will develop and expand an SME and that you can draw benefit of that a few years later. Well, that business angel then, today there are 40,000 in the United Kingdom, 400,000 in the US and 4,000 in France. That's why we need to then fund the SMEs, but at the same time we need to then look at terms of payment, to look at their own cash flow situation.
That was part of the package proposed by Italy, right?
It's one of the Italy proposals that I've started now to implement, because then our president has now decided that decided in December to legislate terms of payment of 60 days would be the maximum terms of payment. Then from April thereafter, we will then negotiate sector by sector, and if that's not enough, if there is not a commitment to go be under 60 days, it's 67, it's then 47 in France, that is not enough, and our companies are suffering in terms of their cash flow, and we will legislate a second time where necessary before the end of the year on terms of payment.
We talked about the Small Business Act to give a more positive economic environment.
The Small Business Act, it is in America, it's a law that was set aside and award some government contracts to small and medium-sized businesses. What we'd like to do is to recognize and acknowledge in Europe, not only in France, of course, but in Europe, the strategic role and status of SMEs. That's why we have now managed to convince France as well as the European Commission to prepare and draft that Small Business Act in Europe. The proposals then will be on the table in June, as you know. On the 1st of July, France will take over the presidency of the European Union for 6 months. During that period, SMEs will be very much prioritized then to enable those companies then to fit into a strategy.
Could you give us a concrete example of this Small Business Act?
Tangibly, we will make sure that those SMEs are innovative and that they are supported more strongly by European funds today. Whether I'm talking about the R&D Framework Fund or the FEDER Fund, together, those funds must finance innovative projects much more than they're currently doing.
Talking about public funds here, right?
Yes, European funds, then fed by the European budget today available, and that must be more assigned to those innovative then sectors.
Now, to come back to Euro4, given the Fed's policy, which is to bring interest rates down, what do you think about the European Central Bank's policy?
The ECB's independence must be upheld, and it's not for me to comment on that. However, today, the value of the euro is hampering our exports, especially major exports, and I'm very much aware of that fact. Plus, then our European production costs denominated in euros, and our sales, however, are denominated in
That's a problem there, but
which is hampering then our exporting companies in France. Then it's causing those companies to outsource. That is, that production is being outsourced to dollar zones.
So what you think is that Jean-Claude Trichet should bring interest rates down to give Europe a break?
That would be quite a good option there to reduce those interest rates, because it will then boost the economy that is looking quite weak over there, the American economy I'm referring to here, then, and which will have a trickle effect over to Europe. So probably a drop in interest rates would be a good thing, but the ECB should probably decide that, and it's not for me to comment on that, really.
Yes, they're very touchy on that point. Let's get back to purchasing power, because corporations are at the heart of the reforms put forward by Sarkozy, but the economic situation is not in favor of that. The IMF revised its forecast in 2008 to 1.6%, which is lesser than what Christine Lagarde forecasted for France, and 1.5% in the US. Now, can reforms be carried out in such an economic
context?
Reasons
to do that. I support going further in the adjustment reforms in France. At a time when French economy is slowing down, we need to give more scope and freedom for the market operators. We need to boost competitiveness, then to benefit, then that price
Is this not
drop.
just wishful thinking? Are corporations going to use over time if they don't anticipate any growth, if the board's morale isn't too good?
It's not only that about easing only the economic burden on our companies. Look at the work contract. Social partners agreed to ease the terms and conditions of those work contracts to make them more flexible, then to meet the needs of both company leaders and to ensure security more of employees. That is where we must go now. We need to reform more because the situation demands that, because it's tougher, and because also we must support very strongly the President's reform program.
More difficult to get tangible results. Now, President Sarkozy said the state would inject funds in the industrial site of ArcelorMittal in Gandran to prevent it from closing down. Now, do you think the state should invest funds?
The government cannot keep its eyes closed then on this type of restructuring. Take the Jourdan company, fine company that went into receivership. Well, I managed to bring together all the different employee representatives, trade union representatives involved, as well as the local authorities there. This case was then reopened and reviewed then by a number of investors. So a partial then a buyout or transfer of the assets of the Jourdan company is now on the agenda and will be on in the next few days.
What about ArcelorMittal in particular?
We need companies to sell, and they need to be bought. Today, that is happening with Jourdan.
And what about ArcelorMittal? Do you think the state should buy it up?
I didn't know that Mr. Mittal wished to hive off then a number of then assets there, but I have been thanked by the President to have reviewed an alternative, and by Mittal to have been given 2 months to enable that alternative to be reviewed. If there's no alternative, we will see. But the fact that this case has been is going to be reviewed in the next 2 months is a very fine thing indeed.
Thank you very much, Hervé Novelli. Let me remind our viewers that you are Secretary of State in charge of businesses and foreign trade. This is the end of the business interview. Thank you.